Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, welcome to the G. Jimmy's World Order's taking over now, brother.
The following announcement has been brought to you by Jimmy's World Order.
During mid to late 1997, the WWF and WCW went a little overboard with factions, gangs, and stables. But now that I'm older and wiser, and even a wrestler myself, I now know everything is predetermined. It wasn't the boss pulling all the strings, it was mainly the gangs in the locker room. That being the Kliq, BSK, you name it, but mostly the Kliq. But Knife, there are no gangs in wrestling. I hear you barking, big dog. But, as I say, Q Vole, it's the G and Geek, and you're watching Gangs in Wrestling. 1997 was a huge year in wrestling for so many reasons. WCW well and truly hit its stride. It felt like there was no stopping Ted Turner's pro wrestling division as it became the world's #1 promotion thanks largely to the success of the NWO. The gang warfare concept that Eric Bischoff introduced to WCW TV was a masterstroke that appealed to the disenchanted adult wrestling fanbase formerly alienated by WWE's cartoon-like direction. For the first time ever, Vince McMahon was actually worried that WCW would actually put them out of business. And it felt possible for the first time ever that the WWF, E, could possibly go under, as the gap in ratings between Raw and Nitro was more than an entire point, as the NWO were providing fans in ECW with a product only a step away from real reality, as opposed to WWE's cartoon-like product. But if it wasn't for all this, McMahon would have never thought of finally realizing that wholesale changes needed to be made to his product if he was going to survive well into the new millennium. In the mainstream, Jerry Springer was at his peak. WCW was promoting gang warfare, and ECW was presenting gritty, hardcore wrestling with shoot promos blurring the line between fiction and reality. Because you see, all we wanted was reality. Or as close as an approximation to it as possible. And by the late 90s, WWE was already promoting more realistic and mature themes aimed squarely at adults, for example, the Nation of Domination, which would develop into its most memorable form in 1997 as a pseudo-political group mirroring the likes of the Black Panthers in real life. God, good times. And I bet I'm gonna be pondering all that while I'm editing all this in my studio. And I bet you anything I'll be wearing a wrestling t-shirt that clearly shows my age. And now that we got a backstory on all this, now we can look forward to the video. Now let's get into it. Gangs in wrestling? Why yes, and we're gonna start with the biggest one of them all, the Kliq. Ah yes, the infamous curtain call. This is where I first learned about the Kliq. Let's just talk about their formation since there's so many videos on the Kliq.
What we're gonna do right here is go back.
How far back?
Way back. Back into time.
To a time where they didn't ruin the careers of Jean-Pierre Lafitte, Vader, and Chris Candido. And not to mention the fact that they were hated by the whole fucking locker room. But anyways, the story goes like this. The founders of the Kliq is Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. In would come Kid, X-Pac of course, and then would come in Triple H. Oh, and Shawn, can't forget about Shawn. Triple H would even go on record saying that he would casually run into these guys because he would usually ride with different guys and he didn't want to stay in the same car for 4 hours bitching about the same old shit. He would eventually run into Kevin Nash in the airport. Kevin told him to roll with us. We're gonna pick up Kid after, and the rest was history. I'm not gonna lie, the Kliq had significant glitch on the locker room. But for every action, there's a reaction. BSK, or Bone Street Crew. But before we get into that, let's talk about these gangsters right here. Yes, the Insane Clown Posse. Whatever you may think about these guys, believe it or not, ICP is actually an acronym for their gang. Yes, these J-Cats are from a gang called Inner City Posse. Now ain't that some shit? Legitimizing your hood into a rap group? More than that, into a music empire? Kudos. Now where the fuck were we? Oh yeah, BSK. When I asked Savio Vega what BSK was, he straight up looked into my eyes and said, "If I told you, I'd have to kill you." On screen, The Undertaker has been part of many different teams and factions over the course of his illustrious career, from tag team partnerships with his kayfabe brother Kane, to his leading role as the head of the Ministry of Darkness, and even aligning himself with the McMahons to create the supergroup, the Corporate Ministry. But behind the scenes, however, The Undertaker led a different kind of faction, born out of the need to stop the overwhelming domination in the locker room brought by the rival group, the Kliq. As I stated earlier, throughout the mid-90s, the Kliq had assumed a lot of control over the creative storylines and how matches were won, with Shawn Michaels, Kevin Nash, Triple H, Scott Hall, and Sean Waltman banding together to give themselves more negotiating power. Other wrestlers in the locker room felt pressured by the Kliq and decided that they couldn't continue to run unopposed. You see, in 1993, The Undertaker, a man who demanded respect amongst his peers since the early days of his career, poured his closest allies in the business even closer, and through a love of playing dominoes with one of the oddest combinations of WWF wrestlers you'll ever see. And out of the ashes, BSK was born. Judging by the way I'm talking about him, you would assume that The Undertaker was the one who started BSK. But no, the Godfather went on record stating that Yoko was the one who started BSK. Yoko was always the mouthpiece at the time, he stated. It stood for the Bone Street Crew. It included Henry Godwinn, The Undertaker, Yokozuna, Rikishi, Savio Vega, Bryan Adams, Paul Bearer, and Papa Shango, otherwise known as the Godfather. Then Mideon came up a year later and joined too. Mideon was already friends with a lot of the guys. He was the last inductee into BSK. In fact, you had to have Undertaker and Yokozuna discuss if he could be in or not. Oh shit, no pressure there, huh? Oh, and I forgot Fuji was with them too, and they called him Uncle. These men banded together, not only for functional reasons, I mean they traveled together, lodged together, ate together, everything. The men who were drawn together because of business soon realized that they had a lot more in common as they sat discussing their last matches and how each of them could improve over a beer or 10. These men created a lasting bond which all of them talk of fondly to this day. I would like to leave BSK right here for a little bit to talk about where their name came from. And since this is somewhat of a gaming channel, let's talk about dominoes. The age-old tabletop game of dominoes can trace its lineage back to the earliest games that humans ever played, with something created for the pure reasoning of entertainment and fun. The domino pieces were originally simple stones with scratch symbols to indicate different values of each rock. As the game evolved and mankind's ability to create became more sophisticated, people began to carve animal bones into pieces which resemble an early form of the modern-day domino. The rich elite reformed a more luxurious form of the early domino game, with fine stones being inlaid with pieces of animal bone and ivory from tusks. This is where we derive the modern term for the domino, bones. And apart from their shared passion for the wrestling business, the members of BSK and WWF shared other hobbies, the main one being playing dominoes into the early hours of the morning on long journeys, and often accompanied by a swig or two of Jack Daniels. These were just a bunch of guys that hung out together, rode together, listened to the same type of music, did the same type of shit at night, and they played dominoes. Yoko would even talk gangster. One time he said, "BSK, Bone Street Crew in the house." That was Yoko starting it all. And like any sane group of young adults, these guys would actually do something a little too gang related. The members of the Bone Street Crew went out and got tattoos, marking their lifelong allegiance to the group. Obviously, The Undertaker has the best one. He always takes his singlet off at the end of a match, and when he does, bam! BSK Pride. In ending, Their simple existence meant that they were able to put a limit on the powers of others within the pro wrestling industry, for better or for worse. Either way, behind the scenes, BSK had a huge impact on the whole of pro wrestling. It's fascinating to look back on 1997 and see the start of the momentum that would eventually see WWE through the 2000s, and McMahon finally conquering WCW by buying them out. Well, before I end this video, I feel like I should be talking about the gangsters in indie wrestling, but then again, I feel like that's a whole other video. Oh well, that's all I have for you for now. Get the fuck on.